All right, everybody. So here we are taking a look at identifying an issue when we're looking at, dialogue or any sort of writing or arguments. And we'll also, towards the end, talk about different types of claims, right? The difference between subjective and objective claims. Okay, so, last class we took, or last lecture, we took a look at an argument. What is an argument? And we noticed that an argument always has two parts. There is something to believe in, and there's some reason to believe it. Right? First thing is the conclusion. That's the main point that somebody's trying to make us believe. And the reason to believe it is the premise. Okay, so if I said something like, my brother George makes a lot of money as a doctor, so you should really become a doctor, the premise is that my brother makes a lot of money as a doctor. That's my reason to make you believe that you should become a doctor, right? That would be the conclusion. The issue, as we identified, or as we defined it last time, is just the question of whether or not the main claim is true. So the question that's being answered here is, should you really become a doctor? And in this case, somebody is making an argument that yes, you should become a doctor. Right? So the issue is, should you? Okay, let's take a look at this. Everybody is saying the president has made us the laughing stock of the world. What a stupid idea. He hasn't made us a laughing stock at all. There's not a bit of truth in that notion. Okay, well, if somebody said this to you, are they presenting an argument? Again, if it's an argument, it has to have those two parts to it. A main claim, a main point, right? Their conclusion, and a reason to believe that conclusion. So take a look at the passage one more time. Everybody is saying the president has made us the laughing stock of the world. What a stupid idea. He hasn't made us a laughing stock at all. There's not a bit of truth in that notion. Well, what is the main point here? It looks like the main point this person is saying is that it's not true that the president has made us the laughing stock of the world. Do they give us any reason to believe that? Well, they don't really, right? All they say is that it's stupid to believe that. So they don't really give us a reason. I mean, it's stupid to believe that he's made us a laughing stock. They haven't really given us a reason to believe that he hasn't. In fact, they just restate their claim here. He hasn't made us a laughing stock at all. They just say that, right? So really what they're doing is not really giving us an argument. They're just saying the same thing over again, right, in different words. He hasn't made us a laughing stock. It's not true he's made us a laughing stock. It's a stupid idea to think he's made us a laughing stock, right? So they're not really saying, they're not really giving us any reason to believe he hasn't made us a laughing stock. They're just saying that claim over and over again in different ways. Okay? So not an argument. Dan was happy the day he bought his new car. You can only really be happy if you buy a new car. Okay, so is there a main point here? Is there a main claim that somebody wants us to believe? Well, let's take a look at the first claim. Dan was happy the day he bought his new car. They're not really trying to convince us of that. They're just saying that, right? Let's look at the second claim. You can only really be happy if you buy a new car. Well, that seems to be the main claim because that first claim, the specific example of Dan, is used to support the idea that we'd only really be happy if we bought a new car. So here we have an argument, right? With the first sentence being the premise, and then the second sentence being the conclusion. Okay. So the issue here then would be the question that this person answers. So if the conclusion is that you can only be happy if you buy a new car, the question, right, the issue is that true? Will I only be happy if I buy a new car? Right? That would be the issue. Okay. So when identifying an issue, we're trying to figure out what's the main issue. The first thing you should do is figure out, well, what's the main point? What's the central claim that's in question here? That's the issue. Right? The issue is that central claim in question. The main issue is the question of whether or not that main point is true or false. Sometimes it can be hard to find. Again, as we mentioned in the last lecture, people talk organically, right? We write organically. We don't necessarily say explicitly, hey, here's my conclusion and here are my reasons to believe it. So you kind of have to listen carefully when people are talking, to figure out, well, okay, what is it that they're really trying to convince me to believe? Because that the question of whether or not that's true is the issue that we're discussing here. Right? So obviously, again, and I've said this before, the hint is look for the conclusion first. Look for the main point first. The question of whether or not that's true or false, that's the issue. Okay, let's do some practice here. What's the main issue in the following passage? Letting your children surf the net is like dropping them off downtown to spend a day doing whatever they want. They'll get in trouble. Okay, so what's the main issue here? Is it A, whether letting your children off downtown to spend the day doing whatever they want will lead them into trouble? Is that the 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 question that's trying to be answered here? Is it B, whether or not letting your children surf the net would lead them into trouble? Or is it C, whether restrictions should be placed on children's activities? Okay, now you may jump immediately to C because it sounds like you're talking about restricting a child's use of the internet, but that's not explicit here. What's more explicit is this idea that letting your child surf the net will lead them into trouble, right? So the question that this passage is really addressing is whether or not letting your children surf the net will lead them into trouble. That's kind of the question that's being answered here. Let's take a look at another example. Most people you find on university faculties are people who are interested in ideas, and the most interesting ideas are usually new ideas. So most people you find on university faculties are interested in new ideas. Therefore, you are not going to find many conservatives on university faculties because conservatives are not usually interested in new ideas. Okay, a lot of sentences. This is how lots of people talk, right? Lots of sentences, not a lot of formal or careful consideration of how the sentences work together. So, as you read this, what is the question what's the main question that's being answered here? Is it whether or not conservatives are interested in new ideas? Do they give us any reasons to believe whether or not that's true? Is it B, whether you'll find many conservatives on university faculties? Do they give us any reason to believe whether or not that's true? Is it C, whether people on university faculties are interested more in new ideas than in other ideas? Is that really what's the main question being addressed here? Or D, is it whether most people are correct? Okay. So if you look at the passage one more time, most people you find in university faculties are people who are interested in ideas. And the most interesting ideas are usually new ideas. Two claims there. So most people you find in university faculties are interested in new ideas. Claim. Therefore, hint, hint, you are not going to find many conservatives on university faculties because conservatives are not usually interested in new ideas. So think about those words there. Therefore usually leads to a conclusion. Because is usually the premise to believe the conclusion. So really the conclusion here is that you are not going to find many conservatives on university faculties. So the issue was whether or not that's true, right? Will you find conservatives on university? Will you find a lot of conservatives on university faculties? That's the issue. And everything else they said in this passage are reasons to believe their answer to that question, right? Their answer being, you are not. going to find many conservatives on university faculties. Now, again, an argument is an argument, regardless of whether or not the premises are true, regardless of whether or not the conclusion is actually true. As long as there's a reason to believe something, it's an argument. Okay? So in this case, the issue is obviously going to be B. One last passage here. In 2007, the Dominican Republic banned the sale of 2 brands of Chinese toothpaste because they contained a toxic chemical responsible for dozens of poisoning deaths in Panama last year. The company that exported the toothpaste, the Danyang Household Chemical Company, defended its products. Okay, so this is what they said. Toothpaste is not something you'd swallow, but spit out. So it's totally different from something you would eat, one company manager said. Okay, here's the question. The company manager was taking a position on which issue? What is the actual question that the company manager is answering? Is it A, whether DHCC included toxic chemicals in its toothpaste? Is it B, whether toothpaste should be eaten? Is that the question the manager was actually answering? Was it C, whether the DHCC did anything wrong by exporting its toothpaste? Or is it D, whether China should have better product safety controls? Okay. So remember, the manager says toothpaste is not something you swallow but spit out. And so it's totally different than something you would eat. Well, what they're really addressing is whether or not they did anything wrong, right? Everything that they're saying is trying to prove or to show that, they are creating a product and there's nothing wrong with the product they created because they say it's something you'd swallow and spit out. It's totally different from something you would eat. So the question that they're answering isn't whether or not there's bad chemicals in a toothpaste, right? The question that they're actually answering is whether or not they felt they did anything wrong by exporting their toothpaste. And they're saying, no, we didn't do anything wrong. You're not supposed to eat the stuff. All right, that's the issue there. Okay, let's see. Now, why is it important to find the issue? Again, I'm hoping this is intuitive to you, but a really common obstacle in clear critical thinking and discourse arises when people appear to be addressing the same issue but are in fact talking about different issues. And we've probably all experienced this. And it can be the most annoying thing, and it could lead nowhere. Sometimes it's easy to see that this is happening. For instance, Joe says, I think that education is the most important political issue of the coming election. Jim says, I want a cheeseburger. Jim is not addressing the issue that Joe brings up, right? So Joe says, I think that education is the most important political issue of the coming election. So the issue is whether or not that claim is true. Is education the most important political issue of the coming election? Right? That's the issue Joe raises. Jim does not talk about whether or not education is the most important political issue in the coming election. Instead, Jim says, I feel like eating McDonald's, not addressing the issue. Now just imagine, and you don't have to imagine, you probably think about real life examples when you have this sort of conversation and how frustrating it is to have, right? Because you're not really getting to anywhere. You're not really addressing what it is you're dealing with in front of you and your friends. Now, that case was easy to see that the 2 people were not talking about the same issue, or at least the second person was not addressing the issue raised by the first person. But sometimes it's not that clear to see. So Joe says, I think that education is a fundamental human right. Jim says, your political interests are so predictable. You always follow the liberal agenda. So when you see or hear Jim say your political interests are so predictable, you always follow the liberal agenda, It may sound like he's addressing what Joe's talking about, but he really isn't, right? Joe's claim, I think that education is a fundamental human right, raises the question of whether or not that's true. Is education a fundamental human right? That's an important question. Should everybody have education? Should everybody have access to education? Is it as basic a human right as like the right to life or the right to be free and not a slave? Is education a right like that? That's an important question. Jim does not address that question. He doesn't say whether or not he believes it is or is not a fundamental human right. Instead, Jim just attacks Joe, right? Jim just says, "Hey, man, your political interests are so predictable. You're just, you know, you're just following a liberal agenda." So Jim strays away from actually addressing the issue. You see this sort of conversation all the time in political debates, or maybe within your family or within your circle of friends, people not actually talking about the issue, and instead, attacking one another or labeling one another or doing something else other than rationally trying to figure out the answer to the issue. But isn't that the most important thing in most cases? Finding out whether or not something is true or false. For some people, they don't care. They just want to hurt somebody else's feelings. So for some people, they don't care. They just want to bring the conversation to where they want to go. Some people, they don't care because they're afraid to touch certain subjects and they want to steer the conversation a different way. Lots of reasons why we don't always stick to the issue. Now, usually in class, what I'll do is ask for two volunteers to read through some dialogue to bring the importance to finding an issue closer to home. Okay, in this case, obviously I'm the only one here, so I will be reading both male and female parts. Okay, so there is a character named Jose and then another character named Juanita. Juanita says, "You never talk to me anymore. The only time we..." And then Joe interrupts her. "What do you mean I never talked to you? Remember last weekend at the park? We talked the whole afternoon and..." "You call that talking? You spent the whole afternoon complaining about my mother coming over. You were trying to punish me and make me feel guilty," Jose says. "I wasn't trying to make you feel guilty. I just didn't think we have to invite your mother over so much," Juanita says. "Yeah, well, what about all the evenings we spent with your brother?" Jose says. "I didn't hear you complaining 10 years ago when your sister came to dinner and left 3 months later." Juanita says, "She'd had a bad time. Her husband just left her. Besides, she only stayed 2 months." Jose, "It was three." Juanita, "It was two." Jose, "It was three." Juanita, "It was 2 months. I remember for sure, and it was 10 years ago. You've got to be crazy and paranoid to hold a grudge that long." Wait a minute. What was the original issue again? The original issue was whether or not Joe talked to Juanita anymore, right? The original issue was about Joe showing um, Juanita enough, care and affection. It had nothing to do with this whole issue about somebody's sister and how long they stayed. But this happens all the time. This happens all the time when we're trying to resolve a problem, but the people that we're talking to, they bring up old resentments, or we're the ones who bring up old resentments, and then we go off on a tangent and we don't actually address the problem. Hopefully, this resonates with you, right? If nothing else, we should develop the skill of realizing what the main issue is so that we can understand one another, get a sense for what we need get a sense for what another person needs, and actually address that need, as opposed to getting caught up in our own emotions and then turning our discussion into a food fight, as opposed to actually strengthening a relationship. This, I'm hoping, if you don't relate to now, believe me, you will. So, Um, if somebody does not discuss the validity of the issue, I should say it differently. If somebody does not discuss the validity of a claim, the validity of a conclusion, they are not addressing the issue. So if you bring up a claim like, "You don't talk to me anymore," If the other person does not address whether or not that is a true or false statement, yes, I do talk to you, no, I don't talk to you. If they don't address that question, they are not actually addressing the issue. Yeah. Now, some claims are not necessarily claims that can be verified. In other words, there are some claims that aren't necessarily objectively true or false. These are subjective claims. Okay. So, objective claims. Objective claims are true or they can be false, but it is independent of what a person believes. It's just how it is in the world. If I said to you, look, I'm holding a remote control for my PowerPoint slides, I'm trying to give you an objective claim. I'm telling you a claim about the world that should be independent upon somebody's personal belief system. If you take philosophy one, if you take a philosophy of epistemology sort of class, this gets into murky waters. But for now, let's just say that any sort of claim that is independent of what a person believes, that's just true or false, because that's how it is in the world, those are objective claims. There are some claims, however, that are dependent upon a person's personal beliefs, right? There are some claims that are dependent on how a person looks at the world. These are value judgments about it, right? These are um, likes and dislikes. I can say stuff like, I like Coke. I like I like Coca-Cola, not I like the drug. I like Pepsi, right? These are claims about my feelings of Coca-Cola and my feelings about soft drinks. Um, I can say it tastes good. I can say um, it's soothing in my throat. These are subjective claims, right? This is this is how I experience something. These are subjective claims. They're not facts about the world. So when we take a look at value judgments are claims that we use to say something is good or bad, better or worse, as a matter of subjective preference. Okay, so I can make claims about what I like and dislike, like I like Coca-Cola, I like coffee, I like the sound of a baby crying or laughing. Laughing's probably better. Those are value judgments. Yeah. Value judgments are subjective, right? They're dependent upon, or they're based upon my experience. I said it differently. They're based upon my personal beliefs about something. They're based upon the way I experience something, as opposed to it being a claim about how the world actually is, independent of me. Okay. Hopefully that wasn't too confusing. Let's take a look at a few claims and see if they're subjective or objective. Okay, I think Coke tastes better than Pepsi. Tastes better than Pepsi. Is that a subjective or objective claim? Well, I mean, you could take a bunch of people and ask them, hey, does Coke taste better than Pepsi? They're going to vary because it's kind of a subjective sort of claim, right? It's based, not like, it is a subjective sort of claim. It's a claim based upon somebody's personal preference, so subjective. You should buy a new car. Well, whether or not you should or should not, that's pretty subjective, right? You can make objective claims like, hey, your car is missing a fourth tire. Your car has no steering wheel, or your car is leaking oil, right? Those are objective claims. Those are truths about the world that are independent upon somebody's feeling of it, somebody's personal experience of it. Um, but the idea of whether or not you should buy a new car, that's subjective because everybody's criteria of when you should or shouldn't buy a car may be different. They can be different. Conan O'Brien is the funniest person on late night television. Hopefully, that's obviously a subjective claim, right? There's no objective measure of funny or funniest. It's just how you experience this person. and we all can experience Conan O'Brien differently. Some of us think he's funny, some of us don't. So subjective. Conan O'Brien has better ratings than Jimmy Fallon. Okay, so this you can look at objectively. You can find actual TV ratings, and you can say objectively that one person has higher ratings, more popular than the other person. More TV sets are watching one person than the other. So it's an objective claim. Hopefully those examples make sense to you. Now, some subjective claims are useful to debate, and some may not be so useful, right? So when we talk about how one person prefers Nike shoes versus Reebok shoes, well, I mean, unless you are working for a shoe company, unless you are a store that sells shoes, I personally don't really find that debate much use. I don't really find that to be of a useful use. I'll say it one more time. I don't really find that to be a good use of my time, having that sort of debate. However, some subjective claims, like claims about right and wrong, morality, ethics, well, those are kind of uh, uh, important claims to debate about. What's the right thing to do? What's the morally right choice? It's useful to talk through reasons to believe um, choice A versus choice B, right? There may not necessarily be an objective fact about whether or not a certain action is morally correct or not, but it's useful to debate it so we can better clarify for ourselves what we think the right choice would be. So a moral value judgment, then, is a value judgment that assigns moral or ethical values to objects or actions. So these are claims that say whether or not, or they are claims that talk to the morality or ethical values of a person. So I'll list some claims to you, and then you can try to figure out for yourselves whether or not you think they are moral value judgments. You should not have cheated on that exam. You should not have cheated on that exam. Well, in this case, we're talking about the word cheated, right? And oftentimes we think of that in terms of morality, in terms of ethics. So sure, that could be a moral value judgment. However, in a different context, maybe somebody is saying to us, hey, you should not have cheated on that exam because, the instructor is very good at catching people cheat. Right? In that case, it's not really a moral value judgment. It's really a judgment based upon whether or not you are more likely to get caught. Right? So not really a moral value judgment, not really a judgment about what's right or wrong in a moral ethical sense, but right or wrong on the sense that, hey, you might get caught by the teacher. Right? So claims aren't necessarily one or the other. Moral value judgments are not. It all kind of depends on context. Somebody says to you, you should not eat cookies before bedtime. For the most part, when we often use that sentence, we're not really making a moral value judgment. You can talk about somebody being a bad person for eating cookies before bedtime, but that's not necessarily the most popular context for using that sentence, right? Usually people talk about eating before bedtime for health issues or for cleanliness issues, hygiene, not necessarily as a right or wrong, moral, ethical sort of thing. Tom is a bad man for having 3 wives. Moral value judgment, right? We're making a moral, ethical sort of judgment about Tom here. Okay? So when we come back in the next lecture, we will take a look at the homework that was assigned, review those questions, and I'll throw in some bonus practice questions to get ready for your first quiz. Hope to see you soon.